The afternoon sun bled across the skyline, turning the steel towers of the city into molten pillars. In the reflection of one cracked cafe window, Cade saw his own weary face staring back at him. He was 23, yet looked older from years of labor, his shoulders hunched from carrying trays and scrubbing floors, while his eyes still carried a spark that had not yet been extinguished. The cafe smelled of brewed caffeine and baked bread, though the aroma could not mask the tension that lay heavy over the district. Dragon banners rippled across the main avenue, outside each banner a crimson cloth bearing the golden sigil of a burning wing. Cade stacked dishes behind the counter, while the manager whispered orders in hushed panic. Today was not an ordinary day. The Dragon Emperor himself had landed on Earth, his convoy descending like thunder from the heavens. Rumor said his armored guard had killed 3 men already for standing too close to the roadway. Nobody could confirm it, but Cade believed it. He had seen what dragons were capable of during raids when he was still a boy, when fire erased entire neighborhoods, leaving only ash and bone. He had lost his father in one such night. The memories still flickered behind his eyes whenever he closed them for too long. A metallic rumble shook the cafe floor. Outside, rows of black-scaled soldiers marched their talons, striking the ground like war drums. The air shimmered with heat from their armored suits, and the few humans who had been brave enough to walk the streets now pressed against walls, their heads lowered in submission. Through the cafe windows, Cade caught sight of the convoy that carried the Emperor. A transport like a mobile fortress rolled past, its steel plating engraved with claw marks, as if the boast of battle survived. The customers inside the cafe grew silent. Cups rattled on tables. The door opened, and the first of the dragons stepped in. They were tall, humanoid in shape, yet every movement betrayed the predator beneath. Their scales glistened like obsidian plates, their horns swept backward in sharp curves, and their eyes glowed faintly gold. The ceiling lamps reflected on their fangs when they spoke to one another in guttural tones that made Cade's skin crawl. He straightened his apron, forced a neutral smile, and moved toward them with a tray. The dragons barely noticed him. They sat at 2 tables, their wings folding close, as their clawed hands tapped the wood impatiently. Cade delivered their drinks, avoiding their eyes. He had learned long ago that dragons could smell defiance. It was then that he noticed the smallest figure among them. A child walked slowly behind the armored guards. Unlike the others, his scales lacked the polish of fire. They were dull gray, almost fragile like cracked stone. His wings were bent inward, and his legs trembled with each step. The other dragons made no attempt to help him. Instead, one sneered, muttering something that made the others chuckle darkly. The boy tried to climb onto a chair, but stumbled and fell face first onto the floor. A sharp silence followed, broken by cruel laughter from the guards. Before Cade could stop himself, his feet moved. He slipped between the dragons, ignoring their snarls, and knelt by the child. The boy made a soft whimper, his body trembling. Without hesitation, Cade scooped him up. The weight was light, far lighter than he had expected for a dragon. The child clutched his shirt desperately, his scaled fingers trembling against the fabric. The cafe froze. Humans gaped in horror, dragons stared in disbelief. A human had touched royal blood. One of the guards growled, his hand tightening on the hilt of his blade. "Unhand the prince, or be cut down," he hissed. Cade's mind screamed at him to release the child, but something stronger held him still. He had seen enough weakness ridiculed in his life. He would not add to it. He stood firm, holding the boy close, his heart hammering like a drum. The door opened again. A shadow filled the entrance. The Dragon Emperor stepped inside. He was enormous, even compared to his guards. His horns were gilded with gold, his scales dark, as midnight, his presence suffocating. Power radiated from him like heat from a furnace. His eyes were molten amber twin suns that burned into every soul that dared look upon him. The guards bowed their heads in fear. The humans pressed themselves against the walls. Only Cade remained upright, though his knees threatened to buckle. The Emperor's gaze locked on the sight before him. His frail son cradled in the arms of a human. Time seemed to stretch. No one breathed. The Emperor's voice rumbled low like distant thunder. "Who dares touch my blood?" Cade swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He fell. "I caught him." Murmurs rippled to the guards, some in outrage, others in disbelief that the human still lived after speaking. The Emperor moved closer his every step, making the wooden floor groan beneath the weight. He loomed above Cade, his shadow swallowing him whole. His eyes narrowed, as if dissecting the young man's soul. For an instant Cade saw fire flash behind those eyes, and he knew he would be burned alive. But then something shifted. The Emperor studied the way his son clung desperately to the human's shirt, refusing to let go. He studied the stubborn defiance in Cade's eyes, a defiance not born of arrogance, but of conviction. The Emperor spoke again, his tone sharper. "What is your name, human?" "Cade." "You risk death for a creature you do not know." "Why?" Cade felt every gaze burning into him. His hands shook, but his voice remained steady. "Because he needed help." Silence followed. Then a low sound escaped the Emperor. Not quite laughter, yet not fury either. He turned his head slightly, and the guard stepped back uncertain. The Emperor reached out one massive hand. Cade expected to be crushed, but instead the hand brushed against the boy's shoulder. The child whimpered, then relaxed at the touch, still holding on to Cade's shirt. The Emperor's voice lowered. "You will follow me." Cade blinked. "What?" "You heard me. Carry him. Come." Gasps erupted in the cafe. The guards exchanged glances, disbelief painted across their reptilian faces. No human was ever commanded to walk beside the Emperor. Cade's stomach turned cold, but he obeyed. He adjusted the child in his arms and stepped after the towering figure. Every step felt like a descent into the unknown. He expected to be led to his execution, or perhaps into some arena where he would be torn apart. Yet when he looked down at the frail dragon boy who clung to him, he felt a strange surge of resolve. The cafe door closed behind them, leaving only silence. The convoy outside shifted as the Emperor returned to his transport. Guards flanked him, yet left a clear path for the human who carried the prince. The gathered crowd of humans gasped, some whispering prayers, others staring in awe. Never before had they seen one of their own walk in the shadow of the Emperor without chains. Cade climbed the steps into the transport. The air inside smelled of smoke and metal. The Emperor seated himself upon a throne of steel that rose from the center of the chamber. His eyes never left Cade. The Emperor spoke one final sentence, his voice cold, yet edged with something Cade could not identify. "You have touched destiny, human. Now, let us see if you survive it." The transport doors sealed with a hiss. The convoy rumbled forward, carrying them toward the heart of the dragon dominion. Cade's fate had shifted in a single reckless moment. The transport rumbled across the sky, its engines humming with a low resonance that made the metal walls vibrate as if alive. Cade sat rigid on a narrow bench, his arms still wrapped protectively around the frail young dragon, whose weight seemed almost nothing compared to the heaviness pressing on his chest. Across the chamber, the Emperor sat upon his steel throne, his golden eyes fixed unblinking upon the human. Not once since leaving the cafe had those eyes strayed. They burned into him with the same intensity as the sun, yet Cade forced himself to meet that gaze, refusing to look away even when fear begged him to lower his head. The boy stirred softly, his voice fragile, like wind brushing over cracked glass. "It hurts," he whispered, his malformed wings twitching against Cade's side. Cade adjusted his hold, whispering, "I know, little one, rest now, you are safe." The words slipped out before he could think, and he almost regretted them until he felt the boy relax against him with a small sigh. The Emperor's claw tapped against the arm of his throne, the metallic click echoing like a countdown. "You speak to him as though he were human." The Emperor said, his tone neither rage nor mockery, but something caught in between. Cade replied, "He is a child." The chamber chilled with silence. One of the guards shifted uneasily, their armor scraping. The Emperor leaned forward slightly, the faintest flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "You do not fear I will strike you down for speaking so plainly." Cade's throat tightened, but his voice did not falter. "Fear does not erase what is true." The Emperor studied him with a look that seemed to slice apart every thought. Finally, he leaned back into the throne, his massive frame settling like a mountain. "You are either foolish beyond measure or braver than your kind deserves. I will know which soon enough." The convoy pierced through cloud and descended into the dragon capital. From a narrow viewport, Cade saw spires of black stone clawing to heavens, each carved with ancient runes that glowed faintly red. Winged sentinels patrolled the skies, their shadows darting like predators across the streets below. Everywhere fires burned in iron braziers, casting the entire city in hues of amber and crimson. Humans were scarce here, the few visible bent low, carrying burdens under the watchful gaze of dragon overseers. Cade's stomach twisted as he realized he had been delivered to the very heart of their empire, a place from which no human had ever returned. The transport landed with a heavy thud. The doors hissed open, and the hot air of the capital swept inside, smelling of ash and molten rock. The Emperor stood towering and commanding. "Bring the human." He ordered, though his gaze remained on his son. The guards surrounded Cade as he carried the boy down the ramp. Crowds of dragons filled the courtyard, their eyes narrowing as they beheld the strange sight. Whispers rippled through them sharp as knives. No human had ever carried a prince. Cade felt each glare press against his skin like burning coals, yet he kept his stride steady, his jaw set. The child clung to him as though he were the only anchor in a sea of scorn. They entered the grand hall of the palace. Black marble floors reflected firelight from towering sconces. Banners hung from the ceiling, each emblazoned with the sigil of flame wings spread wide. The throne stood at the far end, raised upon obsidian steps. Dragons lined the chamber, armored lords and advisors, their eyes gleaming with malice. The Emperor strode forward, and the hall fell silent. He turned and gestured. "The human speaks before the court." Murmurs erupted like a swarm. Cade's pulse quickened. He had not expected this. A guard shoved him forward, nearly making him stumble. He tightened his grip on the boy and stood tall. One of the lords sneered, his scales bright crimson, his horns sharp as blades. "Emperor, you dishonor the throne by allowing a human into this sacred chamber. Cast him into the pyres where his kind belongs." Another added, his voice dripping contempt. "And the whelp he carries is a curse. Weakness in the bloodline will rot the empire. End it now before our enemies send it." The boy trembled, burying his face into Cade's chest. Rage boiled in Cade's veins at their cruelty. Before fear could silence him, he spoke, his voice loud enough to echo. "He is your prince. He is a child, and he deserves life, not scorn." Gasps filled the chamber. No human had ever raised his voice here, let alone defied the lords. A guard's hand went to his blade, but the Emperor raised one claw and the hall froze. His golden eyes locked on Cade's expression, unreadable. "You risk much with those words, human," the Emperor said slowly. Cade met his gaze. "Words mean nothing if truth is silenced." For a moment silence stretched taut as steel ready to snap. Then the Emperor turned from the lords, his voice booming through the chamber. "This human will remain. He will tend the prince. None shall harm him without my command." An uproar erupted. Some lords shouted in outrage, their claws scraping against the marble. Others whispered in fear, unsure what this decree meant. The Emperor silenced them all with a single roar that shook dust from the rafters. "My word is law. Obey or be crushed beneath it." The boy lifted his head, slightly peering up at Cade, his eyes shimmering with something fragile yet bright. "Trust." The guards led Cade away from the hall, though not without snarls and threats muttered under their breath. He was shown to a narrow chamber at the edge of the palace, lit by a single torch. It smelled of stone and smoke, but it was not a cell. The boy was placed gently upon a bed of woven furs, his eyes already heavy with exhaustion. Cade sat beside him, his own heart still racing. When the door closed behind them, the palace noise muffled by stone, the boy spoke in a whisper. "Why did you help me?" Cade hesitated, then answered softly, "Because someone should." The boy's eyes glistened faintly in the torchlight, and he whispered his name for the first time. "Veilric." Cade nodded. "Rest now, Veilric." The boy drifted to sleep, his breathing shallow yet peaceful. Cade leaned back against the cold wall, his mind reeling. He had entered the palace expecting death, yet instead he had been bound to the most fragile life in empire. Outside these walls hatred waited. Inside them the Emperor's decree shielded him, yet also chained him, his fate now twisted tightly with that of the disabled prince. He knew the days ahead would demand more courage than he had ever imagined. And though the hall outside was filled with dragons who wished him dead, Cade could not shake the feeling that the Emperor himself watched from the shadows, not with rage, but with a dangerous curiosity. The night settled heavy around the palace. Cade closed his eyes, knowing sleep would not come easily. He was a human in the nest of dragons, bound to a boy the Empire wished erased. And tomorrow his true trial would begin. The first light of dawn spilled through the narrow window of the chamber, painting the stone walls in a pale glow, and Cade rose from the corner, where he had slept lightly with one eye open. Veilric still lay curled upon the furs, his breathing shallow as malformed wings, twitching as though they dreamed of flight. Cade studied him silently, feeling both pity and a strange determination swell in his chest. This boy was fragile, yes, but not worthless. He had seen men broken by wounds, and still they had found ways to stand again. Why should a prince be any different? The heavy door creaked open, and 2 guards entered, their eyes narrowed with disgust. One growled, "The Emperor commands you bring the boy to the training grounds. Do not falter, human, or you will be cut down where you stand." They stepped aside, leaving Cade to lift Veilric gently from a bed. The boy clung to him, still half asleep, his trust as natural as breathing. They walked through endless halls of black stone, where dragon lords passed them sneering openly. Whispers followed like poisoned arrows. The weak prince carried by a human. The shame of the dynasty. Cade ignored them, though each word stung like fire. The training grounds opened wide beneath the sky, a vast arena ringed with spires, and lit with braziers that spat sparks into the wind. Dozens of dragon youths trained there, their wings beating thunder into the air, their claws slicing through steel mannequins. The sound of their roars shook the ground. When Cade entered carrying Veilric, the laughter began. "Look, the cripple comes carried like an infant. Better to cast him into the pyres now." Veilric's eyes dropped to the ground, his small body trembling. Cade knelt so their eyes met and whispered firmly, "Do not listen. They fear what they do not understand." The Emperor appeared on the raised platform, his presence silencing the arena. His eyes scanned the field, then rested upon his son. For a heartbeat his jaw tightened, as if torn between command and doubt. "Begin," he declared. The youths launched into combat, their movements a blur of strength and fire. Veilric stood at the edge, his legs shaking. One older dragon shoved him hard, sent him sprawling. Laughter roared again. Cade's fists clenched, but he remained where he was, knowing intervention would mean death. Still his voice cut through the jeers. "Stand, Veilric. They laugh because they expect you to quit. Show them wrong." Veilric pushed himself up his knees, scraping against stone. He staggered, but did not fall again. He faced the boy who had shoved him, and though his claws trembled, he raised them anyway. The larger dragon lunged, knocking him down once more. Yet again Veilric rose, his eyes burning with something new. Not strength, not rage, but resolve. The Emperor watched silently, his golden eyes narrowing. For the first time, perhaps, he saw a glimmer in his son that tradition could not measure. When the training ended, Veilric collapsed against Cade's chest, exhausted, yet alive with a faint smile. "I stood," he whispered. Cade nodded, his voice low. "And you will stand again." Days passed. Each morning Veilric trained, though he was mock-beaten and thrown aside. Each evening Cade tended his wounds, whispering words of resilience, teaching him small human tricks of balance, breathing, and focus. They used stones and ropes in secret, fashioning crude devices that helped Veilric strengthen his frail body. Cade even built a harness of leather, and with a crude glider that caught the wind. One dusk, when the skies were painted blood red, he lifted Veilric into the harness and ran with him across the courtyard. The boy laughed wildly as the air carried him for a brief, soaring moment before he stumbled back into Cade's arms. It was not flight, but it was freedom, and his joy echoed across the palace walls. The guards sneered at these strange exercises, but the Emperor lingered often in the shadows, watching unseen. His face betrayed little, yet his silence spoke volumes. He did not stop them. Perhaps curiosity had bound him. Perhaps doubt. Yet shadows grew long in the palace. In whisper halls, Cade overheard lords speaking, treason, their voices sharp with venom. The Emperor weakens with his indulgence. The boy must be erased. Better a clean death than this shame. Another growled, and the human must be silenced. His defiance poisons a court. Cade's blood chilled at their words. He knew he could not warn the Emperor directly, for the lords would twist against him. So he kept silent, waiting and watching, his mind restless with fear. One night, as torches flickered, low, Cade sat beside Veilric, who winced while stretching his bent wings. "They will never accept me," the boy whispered, his eyes downcast. "They already decided I am broken." Cade placed a hand firmly on his shoulder. "Then you must decide louder than they do. Broken bones mend. Broken wings can still rise, but a broken will cannot. You are more than they believe. You are more than even your father knows yet. Veilric's eyes lifted shimmering with fragile hope. You believe that I would not still be here if I did not. In the silence that followed, the bond between them sealed tighter than steel. The next day, the court gathered again, this time for a ceremonial exhibition. Dragon youths displayed their prowess before the emperor, each performance fiercer than the last. Flames roared across the arena, spears shattered under claw strike's wings, sliced through the air with lethal grace. Finally, the crowd grew restless, awaiting the humiliation of the weak prince. Veilric stepped into the arena, limping yet unbowed. Cade stood at the edge, his heart hammering. The jeers began immediately, but Veilric did not flinch. He raised his claws and faced an opponent larger than him twice over. The duel began. Within seconds, Veilric was thrown to the ground, his body trembling under the weight of the crowd's laughter. Cade shouted above it all, "Rise, Veilric. Stand as you did before. Remember who you are." The boy staggered, upright blood at his lip. His opponent lunged again, but this time Veilric sidestepped using the human technique of balance Cade had taught him. He avoided the blow, though it sent him sprawling. Again he rose, again he stood. Again and again, until the laughter turned into uneasy murmurs. The crowd had expected collapse, not persistence. The emperor leaned forward, his claws gripping the armrests, his eyes burning with an emotion none could name. Finally Veilric fell, unable to rise again. The duel was called to an end. His opponent sneered, but the boy lay with a faint smile. "I stood," he whispered once more when Cade rushed to him. The chamber was divided. Some lords hissed with fury that the disgrace continued. Others whispered with reluctant awe. That night, Cade carried Veilric back to the chamber, both exhausted. He laid the boy gently on the furs and sat by the torchlight, lost in thought. Each day grew darker with plot around them, yet the boy grew brighter within. The lords sharpened their claws in secret, yet so too sharpened the will of the prince. And Cade felt it in his bones the storm was coming soon. Beyond the chamber walls, the lords gathered in shadows, forging their coup. Soon the fires of rebellion would ignite within the palace. Soon Cade would face the choice between survival and loyalty. The night pressed heavy, and the air carried the scent of blood yet to be spilled. And while Veilric slept with fragile peace, Cade stared into the darkness, knowing that tomorrow the empire itself might burn. The palace groaned under the weight of silence, as if the stone itself sensed the treachery soon to be unleashed. Cade sat awake in the chamber, his back to the wall, his eyes fixed upon the dim torch that cast long, trembling shadows. Veilric slept nearby, curled upon the furs, his wings twitching as though in restless dreams. The human's heart beat with a rhythm of dread, for he had overheard whispers of a coup, and he knew the storm would break soon. He had no sword, no allies, and no power, except the fragile trust of the boy beside him. The silence shattered with the distant clang of steel and the echo of a roar. The torch quivered in its sconce. Cade rose instantly, pulling Veilric to his feet. The boy's eyes were wide with confusion. "What is happening?" he whispered. Cade's voice was steady, though his stomach twisted. "Danger. Stay behind me." The door burst inward. 3 armored dragons stepped through, their eyes gleaming with murderous intent. The shame, ensignite, one hissed, drawing a curved blade that shimmered with flame. They advanced. Cade grabbed the nearest object, a bronze serving tray, dented from years of use. It was absurd against steel and claw, but it was all he had. He stepped between the assassins, and the prince's voice low but firm. "You will have to pass through me." The first dragon laughed, lunging forward with a slash that cracked the tray in half. Cade rolled aside, swinging the jagged edge into the dragon's face. Scales split and blood sprayed. The beast staggered back with a howl of rage. The second lunge, claws outstretched, but Cade ducked low, kicking its legs and sending it sprawling. He shouted to Veilric, "Run." But the boy shook his head, clinging to Cade's tunic. "No, I will not leave you." The third assassin struck, shoving Cade hard into the wall. Pain exploded across his ribs. The blade raised high for the killing blow, but in that instant a roar thundered through the corridor, shaking the stones. The emperor appeared, his wings unfurled, his claws dripping with fire. He struck like a tempest, hurling the assassins aside in a blaze of fury. His eyes blazed not only with wrath, but with something deeper as he saw the human bleeding and still shielding his son. More rebels poured into the palace. The halls filled with chaos. Blades clashed fire, roared, banners tore from the ceiling. The emperor bellowed commands his voice, shaking the very marrow of the palace. Loyal guards clashed with traitors, steel against flame, blood against stone. Cade dragged Veilric through the chaos, his mind set only on survival. Every corridor burned, every shadow hid another enemy. Yet he did not falter. They reached the grand hall where the throne loomed beneath firelit banners. There the battle reached its heart. Dozens of dragons fought in brutal combat. The air reeked of smoke and scorched blood. Cade's chest heaved as he held a stolen blade in one hand, Veilric clinging to the other. The boy's eyes were wide with terror, yet beneath the fear flickered the spark Cade had lit in him through every lesson, every whispered word of resilience. A traitor lord with crimson scales advanced, his mouth curled into a cruel grin. The cripple dies now. The Empire will be cleansed of weakness. He raised a massive halberd. Cade stepped forward, though his body screamed with exhaustion. He swung wildly, barely deflecting the blow. The force hurled him back, blood spilling from his lip. The lord advanced, ready to finish him. Then Veilric moved. With a cry, he stumbled in front of Cade, his frail wings spread, though bent, his claws trembling as he raised them. "You will not hurt him," the boy shouted, though his voice cracked. Laughter erupted from the traitor. "You cannot even stand without trembling, whelp." Cade dragged himself upright, gripping Veilric's shoulder, steadying him. His voice rang with fierce defiance. "Your strength is not in your wings, Veilric. It is in your heart. Stand." The boy roared, a sound raw and imperfect, yet filled with defiance. He lunged forward, not with power, but with resolve, sinking his small claws into the lord's leg. The dragon bellowed, stumbling. Cade seized a moment, driving his blade deep into the gap of armor at the enemy's side. The lord collapsed, screaming as fire bled from his wounds. The hall erupted with fresh fury. Rebels screamed and outraged loyalists rallied. At the center, the emperor unleashed his full wrath, his wings scorching the air, his claws carving through traitors. Yet as he fought, his gaze fell again and again upon his son, standing beside the human, refusing to break. The battle raged until the last of the traitors fell beneath the emperor's fury. Silence spread across the blood-stained hall, broken only by the crackle of dying flames. The emperor stood upon the steps, his chest heaving, his eyes alight with fire. He looked at his son, who leaned upon the human, battered yet unbroken. Slowly the emperor descended the steps, each stride heavy with finality. He stopped before them, towering over the pair. For a long moment he said nothing, his gaze locked upon his son, then shifting to human, who had shielded him through fire and blade. At last his voice thundered, though edged with something that sounded almost like awe. "You risked everything for him. A frail prince my court despised. A boy even I doubted." Cade met his gaze, his voice hoarse. "He deserves life. He deserves a chance to be more than what you fear he is." The emperor's claws flexed. Then he turned to the court, his voice carrying through the vast chamber. "Hear me. This day treachery sought to erase my blood. This day a human stood where dragons fled. This day my son did not break." His gaze swept the hall, pinning every lord in place. "From this day forward Veilric lives not in shame, but as heir, and this human Cade stands as his guardian by my decree. Any who defy this will be crushed." The hall trembled with the weight of his words. No voice rose in challenge. Fear and awe held them silent. Veilric's eyes filled with tears, not of weakness, but of relief. He whispered to Cade, "You stayed. You always stayed." Cade placed a hand on his shoulder, blood still dripping from his wounds. "And I always will." The emperor studied them both, his expression unreadable. Yet deep in his golden eyes a change flickered. He had built an empire on strength through fear, but here before him stood proof that strength was more than fire and claw. It was the will to rise when beaten, the courage to defend when all hope faltered, the compassion to hold a fragile life and refuse to let go. The palace lay scarred, the banners scorched, the air thick with smoke. But amidst the ruins something new had been born. The bond of a father and son, renewed through the defiance of a human. Cade knew the battles ahead were not finished. The empire would not change overnight. Hatred would still whisper in the halls, and blades would still seek his throat. But tonight he had stood, and Veilric had stood, and the emperor himself had been forced to see that mercy could be stronger than cruelty. The boy leaned against him, breathing softly, his head upon Cade's arm. The human exhaled a long breath, his eyes lifting to the broken banners above. For the first time since he had been dragged into this world of fire, he felt not only fear, but also hope. The Emperor turned away, his massive form casting long shadows as he returned to the throne. His voice rumbled one last decree. The Empire changes tonight. And in that silence, the truth settled heavy and bright. A single act of defiance had altered the course of dragons forever.